Hello, my name is Sarah Furness, and I'm the founder and CEO of Wellbeit, which is a mindful coaching and consultancy. Before I did that though, I flew Puma helicopters in the RAF for 20 years in places such as Iraq and Afghanistan. The reason I'm telling you that is because I received world-class military training that allowed me to be able to perform reliably and consistently under extreme pressure. And so I realized that actually a lot of the training that I received was actually a form of mindfulness. Now, we didn't call it mindfulness back then, but make no mistake, we were training our brains to be able to respond exactly how we needed them to respond when bullets were flying over our head and we were in crisis. And the same is absolutely true for our businesses. Actually, running a business is an incredibly pressurized environment, and there are all sorts of challenges and injects coming at you when you least expect them. So I believe that my experiences in military training are just as relevant in a business as they were when I was flying through Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's my passion to be able to share the best of my military training with mindfulness, which is a form of mental training, so that you can get the best out of your business, so that you can make good decisions under pressure, and that you can lead your team to be able to perform under pressure, all by understanding how the brain works and training it to perform optimally when you are under pressure. So the first thing that you need to know is that your performance at any one time, or your team's performance, is your potential minus interferences. So let me be clear what I mean by interferences. Interferences are anything that is going to degrade your performance. So in the military, we were often very interested in how fatigue would start to degrade our performance. And so as a pilot, we would always try and make sure we had lots of sleep and had to stay in lovely hotels to make sure we got a good night's rest, which was one of the perks of being a pilot. So fatigue is one of those common interferences that we know affects our performance. But I'm going to focus on another one, which seems to have been forgotten about, but I think it's really important. And I think it's something the military trained us really well for, although we didn't necessarily know it at the time. And that is distractions. Let me explain to you. So we now live in a world where we are being constantly distracted. Your attention is a commodity. Any marketeer will agree with me on that, I'm sure. Social media, all of that stuff out there, it's all trying to grab your attention, but your attention is being pulled in lots of different directions. In fact, on average, we spend about 50% of our waking day being distracted. And what that means is that our brain isn't focused in a place that we chose it to be focused. It's just kind of meandered off wherever whatever popped up. And the other thing that happens is that we go from task to task, and we think we can multitask, but we can't. Let me explain to you what I mean by multitasking. So this is what the brain looks like. Obviously, very rudimentary diagram here. And imagine you're looking on a bird's eye view of the brain. The brain will try to split itself into two when you try to concentrate on more than one thing at once. And it will try to make one of those tasks an automatic task. So, for example, we can breathe, we can eat, heart pumps. These are all automatic functions that we don't really have to concentrate on. So when we're trying to do more than one thing at once, the brain will try to delegate one of those tasks to the automatic part of the brain, which is fine if it's a benign task. But if it's an important task, like sending an email, that could actually be incredibly damaging for your business if you don't give your full attention to it. So our brain isn't actually designed to multitask. And when it multitasks, it does two things. It has to do rule activation and also goal switching. And that means that it takes a certain amount of time to switch from task to task. So every time you are distracted from, say, checking your emails, and then you go back to perhaps preparing a presentation, it takes you about a minute to refocus on the task you were doing. And conservative estimates say that that amounts for around 2.1 hours every day. That's how much time you lose by trying to multitask. Now, of course, we live in a world where we're trying to do more with less. So multitasking gives us this illusion of productivity, but all it is activity. It's not productivity. So make no mistake about this, you are actually burning time in your day. And the quality of the output decreases by around 40%. So what you're producing is less, and it's probably not as good as it would have been if you just focus on one thing. So although unitasking feels culturally abnormal, it is a much smarter way to work, and you will increase your effectiveness and also your efficiency. The other thing multitasking does is actually stresses you out, and it puts your brain into the stress response, which is another interference to performance, which I'll go on to later. So the one thing that you could do to make sure that you are maximizing your performance in your business day and to make sure that your team are maximizing their performance is simply to stop multitasking. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing we can do is we can just remove as many distractions as possible by actually prioritizing what the most important task or two tasks are for that day and giving yourself time to focus on that task and that task alone. Funnily enough, we were trained in the military to unitask, which sort of feels like it's a little bit counterintuitive because, of course, we had lots of injects being thrown at us all the time. And part of our ability to be able to operate in combat was to be able to deal with multiple unplanned injects. So how does that kind of level with unitasking? Well, here's the thing. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to train and train and train your brain so that certain tasks do become automatic. So for example, when I was flying my aircraft, if I was in trouble in an emergency scenario, or if I was in a contact scenario where I was being shot at, there was always one thing that we were trained to do, and that was fly the aircraft above everything else. We don't try to navigate, we don't try to do the radios, we don't try to do anything other than just fly the aircraft, because I think it was subliminally understood that we couldn't actually have our attention in more than one place at once. And when you're under stress, you will get tunnel vision anyway, and your performance will decrease. So you want to maximize your chance of performing as well as you can by choosing one thing to focus on. And for us, it was on flying the aircraft. So we've talked about the interferences to our performance. And one of the really key ones, as I said, is distraction. And it has become culturally normal to be distracted, but we can train our brain to unitask, i.e. focus on one thing at once. And the more we do that, the more it becomes habitual. What we want is for our ability to have our attention exactly where we want it to be. We want that to have become a habit. So do as the military do, and we train hard so we can fight easy. So you can practice mindfulness, because mindfulness is literally bringing your attention where you want it to be in one place. And you can practice that on a daily basis when you're feeling calm, so that when you're in crisis and you go into fight or flight mode, for example, the brain's already practiced at being in the space that you want it to be. So that's how we overcome distraction, which is probably the biggest interference that we have to deal with as entrepreneurs, business owners, and business leaders. The second one is stress. So stress has reportedly doubled since the outbreak of COVID, and it's been steadily increasing for the last 10 years. Now, whether or not that's because we're just measuring it more, or whether or not people are stressed is, another debate to be had. But the point is, we're certainly more aware of how stressed we're feeling. And stress doesn't do us any favors when it comes to performance either. So again, we go back to our brain. So this is a picture of the brain, okay? And here, which is this sort of part here, is where the primitive part of the brain is. That's where the amygdala is. And we may have heard of this already. It's where your fight, flight, or freeze stress responses, so that when it detects a threat of any sort, it will send cortisol around your body and get ready for you to run away or turn and fight, for example. Now, the amygdala is excellent at keeping us alive, so let's not be too hard on our amygdalas here. However, a few important things to note about when we are feeling stressed. So remember, the stress response is when our amygdala has activated our fight, flight, or freeze. Now, because it wants to act quickly, this is what happens. This is our prefrontal cortex, which is the more rational side of our brain. It's the part of our brain which is responsible for creativity, for appreciating art, for being able to observe our thoughts and feelings, and for being able to put things in perspective, for out of the box thinking and problem solving, and for storing long-term memory as well. So it's very crucial for learning. Unfortunately, this part of the brain essentially gets isolated when we go into fight, flight, or fright mode. So what that means is that the brain is going to prioritize information from the amygdala so that it can send signals straight down to our autonomic nervous system and get us ready to turn and fight. For that reason, it is very hard to think rationally when we feel stressed. It is very hard to problem solve and think of new ways to solve a problem. And it is very hard to learn new skills. So training under stress or trying to make decisions under stress is actually a very difficult thing to do. Now, again, this is where the military really understood about performance and what we commonly call stress. And actually, stress is something which, for my money, isn't actually very well understood. And we always associate stress as a negative thing. There's a lot of reporting about stress, and it's certainly not a bad thing to be more aware of it. However, we do need to be aware of all of the intricacies of how a brain responds and what we mean by stress. So let me be clear, we in the military were brought up with what we call the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and it was understood that as we get increasingly stimulated and we're fed a lot of kind of threats, as if you were, our performance will actually increase. So you don't actually want to be completely understimulated and bored because your performance is very low. So actually, as you apply a little bit of positive pressure, and that can be a time pressure, that can be, goals to achieve a certain sales target, for example, you apply a little bit of pressure, and what happens is your performance actually goes up. And then at a certain point, that pressure will become kind of overwhelming for our brain in that particular scenario, and then our performance will start to decrease. And this is the area that should probably be known as stress. But what we often tend to talk about is the whole thing as stress. Now, a less known term is a term called eustress. And I'm kind of wishing that I wrote this before I started talking. So eustress is positive stress, if you like. And actually on the right-hand side, what we would really have is distress. So clearly we want to be on this side of the curve, but also more importantly, we want to be around about here. We tend to give ourselves a little bit of wiggle room just so we've got a bit more to go. But actually we want to be in the sweet spot. And in the military, we used to call that the stretch zone. And it's probably something that you're familiar with as well. And the more that you're comfortable being in this area, the more your brain starts to respond really well. And actually what happens over time is you can start to move this curve up so that actually you can be under slightly more pressurized scenarios before your performance drops off. So again, this was something that the military trained us for, and we were trained and trained and trained and trained and trained in optimally pressurized scenarios so that we could actually move our threshold up before our performance kind of tailed off the other side. Now, how does that link to mindfulness? Well, mindfulness also, there's a side to it that people don't normally talk about called distress tolerance. So we tend to think of mindfulness as a relaxation kind of thing that we do, but actually mindfulness isn't about relaxation. Sometimes you will feel more relaxed from being mindful, and that's great if that's what you want. But mindfulness is about training the brain. Recall that I said it's about training the brain to have your focus where you need it to be, okay? And actually that in itself can be a little bit stressful, but on the positive side, it can be stressful because your brain, recall, wants to dart off in lots of different directions. So if you're sitting, for example, to meditate, you might feel quite frustrated. You might feel quite agitated. And actually, you're in an area of stress, and you're positively training your brain to be able to deal with a certain amount of pressure. So what we can actually do is we can start to increase our ability to be in that stretch zone, like I said. And the best way to do that is to find tasks that are optimally challenging that we can give our full attention to. And that is known as flow state. And again, in the military, when you're flying your helicopter, you're often in flow state because it is optimally challenging and it takes your full attention to do it. And, it's enjoyable as well, which is an added bonus of flow state activities. So the more we can do here, the more we can start to increase our ability to deal with pressure. Now, don't make any mistake here. Training under pressure, performing under pressure is different from training when you are distressed. Okay, there is no benefit to trying to learn new things or try to problem solve or to try to make critical business decisions when you're on this side of the curve, because recall that your prefrontal cortex is isolated when we fall off this side, okay? Which means you're not going to be able to think rationally. And because the memory is in the prefrontal cortex, or the longer term memory, you don't learn or assimilate new things either. So training under stress, training your team under stress, trying to make decisions under stress when you're on this side of the curve, not a good idea. You don't increase your tolerance by living on this side of the curve. You increase your tolerance by being on this side of the curve. And that in itself is a really positive thing to do.